All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm the director of the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. It's my pleasure to have you here at our last event of the fall term, something a little bit different, where we're not going to have a formal presentation, but rather a moderated discussion on an interesting topic. But before we get into that, I wanted to draw your attention to our spring lineup, which you can see hopefully on the screen in front of you. We've got a really excellent series of events again, which you can find if you go to gonzaga.edu/climate events. You can register for these. Notice that we have a couple screenings of documentaries. One, The Covenant of the Salmon People, and the other on Without Them, I Am Lost. Those are the two, unlike our usual events, which are live streamed. Those two, because they're documentary screenings, will just be live. So if you wanted to catch those, you'd need to be here in the Hemmingson Auditorium to catch those documentaries. But everything else will be available live here, as well as online live streamed. We'll have the founder of Roast House, Deb DiBarnardo, for our first talk in January. And then two colleagues, actually, from the Western Environmental Law Center, so we'll have some attorneys from there tonight. Two more will be coming in February to talk about their work on the Montana v. Held case, where the youth sued the Montana state government successfully. We'll learn about that really interesting case. Then the screening. Then we'll have a climate scientist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Vermont, will be here talking about his work. And then I'm really excited about our event in April, which is celebrating the 50th anniversary of Expo 50, focusing on specifically the work having been done on environmental justice in our region over the last 50 years, and then looking forward into the future. It'll be a day-long conference at the law school, co-hosted by the Attorney General's Office of Washington State, the U.S. Attorney's Office for Eastern Washington, as well as the Center for Commerce and Ethics at the law school, and then finally, of course, the Gonzaga Climate Institute. So that'll be a really excellent event to put on your calendar. So I hope that you're able to attend that. Of course, all of these events take quite a bit of support, so if you have the means to do so, please consider making a contribution to make it so that we can continue to host these events for you to be able to benefit from, as well as the many other projects that we support in the community. So if you have the means, please consider to support us. So tonight, we're going to have a panel discussion, as I mentioned, about the topic of whether or not we can address the climate crisis at speed and at scale without sacrificing the few wild spaces that are left. This idea came to me in part because there's lots of obvious possible tensions between the idea that we're going to put up lots of solar panels, lots of windmills, lots of smart energy grids, and are we going to, if we're going to do that at the speed that we need to really avoid catastrophic warming, some would suggest we have no choice but to carve through wild spaces to put up those smart grids, or to put those solar panels in sensitive areas where, so do we have to pick between the desert tortoise or solar panels? Do we need to pick between smart energy grids distributing clean energy and intact ecosystems? So this is sort of the point of the conversation, is to invite folks to think about this. So we have three panelists tonight that I'll introduce each in turn. But before I do, I should mention that these colleagues, two of them are from the Western Environmental Law Center, a really excellent legal advocacy organization, really impressive lawyers that do work across the West. And so we're lucky to have them, and also really honored to be on their board of directors. So without further ado, I'll introduce them, and they can join me up here. The first is Kyle Tisdel. Kyle centers at the nexus of public lands and fossil fuel development, with the aim of aligning federal decision-making with the demands of climate science, bringing a managed end to fossil fuel exploration, and ensuring a just transition for indigenous and frontline communities that have endured generations of harms from fossil fuels. Kyle has been at WELC, the Western Environmental Law Center, since 2011, and earned his law degree from the Vermont Law School. Please join me in welcoming Kyle Tisdel. Remind me, Kyle, your title at WELC is?
I'm a senior attorney and the Climate and Energy Program Director.
Excellent. Our second panelist is Matt Bishop, who works on public lands issues throughout the West and leads the Law Center's efforts to protect iconic Western predators, including something we hope to hear a little bit about tonight in particular, wolverines, which we'll explain more about, Canada lynx, grizzly bears, and Mexican wolves. Matt is a graduate of Whitman College, just south of here on the Palouse, and earned his law degree from Vermont Law School. Join me in welcoming Matt Bishop. And then finally, a non-attorney joining us is my colleague, Dr. Greg Gordon, who is the chair of the Gonzaga Environmental Studies and Sciences Department here. After completing his bachelor's in English from the University of Colorado, Greg spent the next 5 years working as a seasonal park ranger in Utah, Alaska, and Washington. In 1989, he moved to Montana to attend graduate school and then spent the next 20 years leading field studies programs in Utah, Montana, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica. In 2005, he returned to the university to earn a PhD in history and was fortunate to come here, or we're fortunate to have him here at Gonzaga since 2011. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Gordon. So this is pretty loose, and we really prepared very little. What I'd like to do is just invite each of our panelists to share brief prepared remarks, and then really the opportunity is to sort of facilitate a discussion about this hard topic. So this is not a scripted event. So we're happy to sort of maybe start with Kyle, I think, to try and talk about what we need to do to address the climate crisis from his perspective and sort of set the table for what needs to be done, and then we'll proceed down the line. So, Kyle.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Gonzaga, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me just start by telling you a little bit about the work that WELC does and the approach that we take to our public lands, fossil fuels campaign. And then hopefully, we can just go through that somewhat quickly and open it up for a discussion, which I think is what I'm looking forward to most today. WELC and the Climate and Energy Program in particular, we operate sort of at the nexus of public lands and fossil fuel extraction. So a lot of that work and the bulk of fossil fuel extraction on public lands happens in the Western US, which is really where our work is centered. And a part of that campaign, or the part of the work that we do, we have three primary sort of things that are animating our thinking. One is bringing a managed end and a rapid managed end to fossil fuel exploitation on public lands. And I can go into a little bit more detail later about sort of the tools and how we go about doing that, but that is certainly a primary driver for our work. And that's motivated by simply the science and the timeline of the climate crisis, right? We cannot continue to exploit fossil fuels and hope to maintain a livable planet. The second primary sort of driver behind our work is ensuring a just transition for people and communities primarily who have been at the front lines of fossil fuel exploitation, oftentimes for generations. So how do we think about those communities? How do we help to those communities to transition to different economies, to address the legacies of harm that they've been forced to endure? So that's a central part of our work as well, is not just ending fossil fuels, but what comes next. And then the third real primary thing that we focus on is accountability, right? There is a lot of profit that private companies have gotten from that exploitation, that our systems are and our laws, quite frankly, are aimed at facilitating that exploitation and the private profit that's come from it. So we really look at how do we hold industry accountable for the harm that it's created, and how do we basically create a framework for that accountability within the very narrow window that the transition has to occur within. So the other sort of elements of the talk tonight, which really are sort of focused on how do we balance the rapid transition in front of us with, trying to address harm to species, habitat, to communities. We can get into a little bit more of the detail there, but those are really the sort of three animating things behind our work. And I'll turn it over to Matt, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. Should use the microphone.
Yeah, otherwise the live stream folks won't be able to hear anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, sure. So I'm in WELC. We have actually two program areas. We have like a wildlife and wildlands program and a climate program. And for me, growing up in Montana, I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time outdoors, summers in Glacier Park, out backpacking on the rivers, and I really just developed an affinity for the sort of wild places and wildlife that really make those places so special. So a lot of the iconic predators, wolverine, grizzly bears, lynx, wolves, you name it. I just had a real affinity for those species, and that's really kind of inspired me to go to law school. And I come at it from more of like a biocentric perspective, where for me, the motivator and what I'm really passionate about are those species. And so that's why I went to law school, and I wanted to do that work. And when I started at WELC, I got fortunate enough to get my dream job back in 1998 in the New Mexico office of WELC. I worked for free just to kind of get my foot in the door, but that was the idea.
Living out of a van.
Living out of my van, but trying to make myself indispensable and to do the work because I was so passionate about protecting species. That's kind of where I came at it from. So I'm really not a climate litigator like Kyle is in that program group. I'm more motivated by wildlife and protecting wildlife, but over the years, when you're really talking about dealing with wildlife and protecting species, the line between the two program groups is starting to really blur because all the species I'm working on now, and I've been working on them for 25 years, that's when I started, you can't talk about conserving and protecting species like grizzly bears, even Mexican wolves or desert tortoises, I work on all these animals, without really dealing with climate. And so I've been kind of like a reluctant climate guy who's come in and had to like learn a little bit about climate models and how they work in order to do my work and really address some of the threats. So a few examples are, like right now, I worked a lot on grizzly bear delisting and trying to keep them protected in the lower 48. And people think, well, how does climate change really affect grizzly bears? Well, in the Yellowstone region, for instance, grizzly bears, they eat a lot of things and they go a lot of places, but they really rely on 4 food sources: seeds from whitebark pine trees, army cutworm moss, cutthroat trout, and meat from ungulates and bison, elk. But 2 of the 4 main food sources in the Yellowstone region are in drastic decline. The cutthroat trout in particular, but also the whitebark pine, which I'm sure you've heard about, is recently listed. But the seeds from the whitebark pine, they're down almost 70% in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So you say, well, what is that? And that's all related to climate change, by the way. Well, what does that mean for the bears? Well, it's interesting enough, because the bears aren't getting enough food from the seeds, they're relying more on meat. They're relying more on elk and bison. The northern elk herd's in trouble, but they're also relying more on livestock, and they're getting more in trouble with livestock and fall hunters around gut piles and things. So the reliance, heavy reliance on meat is getting them more trouble. So where there used to be 2 grizzly bear mortalities related to livestock a year throughout the 1990s, when the whitebark pine decline started to happen, started in 2000, it peaked about 2010. If you look at the graphs, the mortalities of conflict removals and from grizzly bears getting in trouble with livestock went almost tenfold to about 20 a year. And that's where we are now. And interestingly enough, over that period, people will say, well, there's just too many bears. Over that period, from about 2000 to today, the population actually kind of leaned towards stasis, and it's about leveling out, up and down. Now they're dispersing and they're colonizing more areas. They're getting out, which is what we want them to do for recovery. But they're getting in a lot more trouble. So I'm working on issues about increased livestock grazing on public lands near the park. And what does that really mean for grizzly bears? But that's just an example of where climate change is sort of indirectly affecting the species I work on. The other one is the wolverine, which we got, and maybe you want to talk about that later. Maybe I should not get too.
Well, actually, I'm really tempted. And
Get going,
Make sure you can hear your own voice so the people at home can too. Yeah, maybe just take a second because it's really big news today. And I think it's really exciting to share, what happened today and how you and WELC were contributing to that.
Yeah, so we've been working on trying to get wolverine federal protections for 15 years, a couple rounds of litigation. They are the polar bear of the lower 48. They are custom built for cold, snowy environments. They have a double fur coat, they have a wool coat underlayer, and a top coat, like a water-shedding outer layer. They have broad snowshoe feet with crampons for claws. They're just built for high mountains. And by the way, they only live in areas with snow. And what's super interesting about this is where I got kind of pulled into the climate modeling was they did it in 2010. They did a study. They overlaid areas with persistent spring snow in the entire world, around the world, Scandinavia, lower 48s. And they came up with certain dates for when the snow was there. And they overlaid that with the known occurrences of every wolverine den in the world. And 97% of those dens fell within that snow model. And then a couple of years later, they did a study on how that snow projecting out using the IPC models of Washington, what would that look like for wolverines? And you go mid-century and you go into the century, and it's not good. And so finally, and good news today was after 2 rounds of litigation, the most recent administration went back and just issued a good decision today to list on the basis of climate change. So I think it's a significant decision in terms of dealing with climate science, addressing uncertainty, and finally giving species like wolverine, the protection they deserve. But it's just getting started in terms of what's next. But
So
that's a good
listed
example.
on the Endangered Species Act, according to the Endangered Species Act, as threatened on climate reasons for that endangerment finding.
Yeah, that's
Or that
right.
threatenment-
That's part of it. There's also a small population, some genetic issues,
Okay.
but the climate change is the driver.
That's interesting.
And the agency biologists back in 2013, who actually wrote the proposed listing rule, recommended it back then, but for whatever reason, for political or policy reasons, they denied that.
I hadn't
since then.
heard the polar bear of the lower 48. That's a great way of thinking about it. We should loop back to that because that's a really interesting way of connecting the climate and species issues. But let's move forward a little bit more and invite Dr. Gordon to share some thoughts from the perspective of an environmental historian leading our environmental studies and sciences department, and sort of the work you do as an environmental historian and as a professor teaching this with young people.
Sure. I want to think a little bit about hope and despair, and polar bears being an example of both of those. Tomorrow marks the beginning of COP28, the 28th conference of the parties to address climate change. 28. The 28th year, meaning that we've been thinking about how we might possibly address climate change sometime in the future 28 years ago. That's longer than a lot of people in this room have been alive. We've got a lot going on, it's no secret to anybody. Right, greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase despite international conferences, despite our efforts. We continue to see sea level rise. It used to be 30 years ago when we were talking about climate change, we were talking about, how are we going to save the polar bears? Climate change is now a human problem, right? We're seeing the effects right in front of us. We're seeing things like hurricanes, catastrophic flooding, loss of snowpack, droughts, loss of crop failures, increased migration patterns, disruption for human communities across the world. Around us, catastrophic wildfires, loss of property, lives, livelihoods. It's a human problem. And we're still not doing anything about it. So, throw on top of that, I don't know, we continue to shoot each other. We're still, engaged in, we're going to engage in a war in Europe with tanks. That seems kind of old-fashioned. We've got a war in the Middle East. We've got The largest cause of death in the U.S. is now suicide. It's surpassed both cancer and traffic accidents and heart disease. So
you're starting with despair.
I don't have a lot of faith, and I'll just sort of lay my cards on the table, in humanity, Western civilization. I don't see a lot of evidence that human beings are really capable of doing much, even when our own lives and our own well-being is directly affected. So I've kind of lost my faith in the ability of humans to do very much. And I want to share a different story with you. 3 years ago, the Coeur d'Alene tribe released 1,500 Chinook salmon at the headwaters of Hangman Creek, 60 miles upstream from Spokane. Most of those fingerling salmon swam past 4 dams on the Spokane, or 6 dams on the Spokane River without fish passage. They swam across 4 massive dams on the Columbia, including Bonneville and the Dalles Dam, which not coincidentally generate most of the electricity for Google and our internet access. They made it all the way out to the ocean. Most people, especially non-tribal people, thought, oh, well, they'll die out in the ocean, they'll become food for larger fish. It was nice they made it. And then 2 years ago, 2 of those salmon, having grown to full size as adults, they swam all the way up the coast of Alaska, gained about 20 pounds, and began to swim back up the Columbia River. They made it all the way to Chief Joseph Dam, past Bonneville, past the Dalles, all the way up, and they bumped into Chief Joseph Dam where they were netted, and one of them was brought back alive and released into Hangman Creek, right at Quelchon Golf Course, just outside of Spokane. My point is that if we just give wild critters a chance, they have the ability to persevere. Those salmon are swimming up against polluted waters, they're going over dams, they're going through backwaters, they're going through reservoirs, they're making it, they're figuring out how to survive. I'm pretty sure, grizzly bears are great at survival, right? They're figuring out how to negotiate this human landscape. They're figuring out how to make corridors. Wolves we see wolves, the incredible successful reintroduction of wolves. Wolves have made it from Yellowstone to Idaho, into Montana, down into Colorado occasionally, into Utah, California. And if we just protect the habitat, and yeah, climate change is affecting things, but I'm pretty sure that life has got to figure out a way to make it if we just give them half a chance. And so I guess my point is if I had to put my money on Western civilization or salmon, I put my money on salmon.
It's a hopeful note. I see that.
Thank you for ending on the hopeful rather than ending on the despair. Lots, I think we've got teed up. So one of the things that I hope to steer us toward is sort of already on the table sooner than I had anticipated, which is, in a way, prompted by Greg's comments. To what degree, and this is sort of maybe to Kyle or Matt, whichever you feel like it, is the law up to the challenges? So I don't know if I can channel some of your cynicism or despair. Some people would say the law is not sufficient of a tool, the way that we've designed it for ourselves. The limitations we placed on ourselves by the way that we've designed the law is not enough of a tool to get to where we need to go. And to attorneys, how would you respond to that concern? Either of you? Or both?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, interestingly, Matt and I were just talking about this a little bit ago, which is, our legal system is intentionally set up for incremental, moderate change over time. And that system doesn't necessarily lend itself to a lot of hopefulness with the magnitude and scale and speed at which we need to make this transition. At the same time, you can choose any issue and you can see where that incremental change in progress over time leads to sort of tipping points in law or tipping points in jurisprudence.
Can
And
you think of an example just to illustrate that comes to mind?
Same-sex marriage. The listing of Wolverine. It's a 15-year effort, multiple cases, right, where these issues are litigated, and then whether it's a Supreme Court case that says, okay, same-sex marriage is now legal across the entire country, or whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service finally responding to what science is telling them and listing the Wolverine. You can really pick an issue and you can see the point at which that tipping point happens. And I think, we think about in terms of our climate and energy program and the work that we do, we don't think about our work as one-off cases. We think about our cases as how do these cases link together to create a pathway to change and a pathway to create leverage for change. And that leverage can come sometimes through legal wins, sometimes they can come through policy wins or legislative wins, but that's what we're looking to do is to chart that pathway to create those tipping points or points of leverage. And then the other really critical thing that we're also trying to do is build power for change. Attorneys are not organizers, right? We're not going to necessarily be on the front lines and picket lines of some of these fights. But through our engagement with communities and through our work with people, right? Some of this is about how do you empower communities and people to demand the type of change that we need, and I think that is also critically important.
Thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was just thinking back on when I was a history major in college. I never even thought about doing environmental work or being an attorney. But after I graduated, I was working for an environmental group, knocking on doors, dealing with issues, campaigns, and I remember thinking to myself, I actually heard about a case, like an environmental case on the Upper Missouri Breaks, and I thought, wow, they actually stopped this thing in court. That's what really inspired me to go to law school. I felt like, it's one little thing, but it's something. And over the years, I think Kyle's right. There are these tipping points, there are these decision points that happen. The first case I ever worked on was a lawsuit against the federal government for not implementing the recovery plan for Mexican wolves because they weren't reintroducing Mexican wolves. They were down to 7 wolves. We wiped them out. We had 7 individuals left. They were in their genetic crisis, and there was a captivity program, but they weren't releasing them in the wild. That was in 1998. Now they're still in trouble, but at least we have 200 wolves in the wild. We have about 300 in captivity. Probably 5 or 6 separate litigation cases I've worked on, either defending reintroduction, forcing them to do the right thing, forcing them to follow the science. So it's incremental steps, kind of chipping away. But I do think that the law, I think that a statute like the Endangered Species Act is really powerful because it requires the federal agencies to apply the best available science. And we live in a country where you can sue the king, right? It's really special when the government's not doing the job, citizens like you and me and client groups can sue the government to say, hey, you're not doing the job and we're going to force you to do it. That's really unique and special if you think about that around, from an international perspective. So I love that about it. It's a great equalizer.
So the incremental aspects that you're both emphasizing, though, just to lift up the tension that is inherent in the incremental nature of the changes to the law and the setting of precedents and the energy it takes to create a tipping point for a real but still too modest achievement is just incommensurate with the speed and scale of the climate crisis. And I don't know what the alternative is. It's not a fair question, but benevolent dictators, philosopher kings. As a philosopher, I guess we could go that route, but that seems to have sailed with Plato. So, but I mean, we do need to realize, right, that the incremental nature of it, the slow incremental nature of it, is out of sync with the speed of the crisis. In part because, as Greg was mentioning and reminding us, we've wasted the last 30 years. So if we had been really working hard on incremental change much, 30 years ago.
Well, I wonder if the law is also a way to hold back that speed in which you're talking about. One of the things I worry about is, are we going to undo National Environmental Policy Act and NEPA and the EIS process? Are we going to convince ourselves the climate crisis is so great, and I'm not saying that it's not, but it seems that the law is also a tool in which requires us to go slow. It requires us to think about our actions over the long term. You think about how long it takes to do an EIS and go through the NEPA process, and I worry that in times of crisis that we short circuit that we say, well, we need to get these windmills up and going, we need to get these transmission systems down and going, and we're going to do a categorical exclusion, we're going to prevent, we're going to do an end around NEPA, we're going to, have Congress is going to pass a law and say, well, we're going to forget that and exclude NEPA and doing the EIS analysis in order to achieve a particular goal. And one of the beauties of NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, right, is that it requires us to think about what we're doing. It requires us to consider all actions. It requires consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service about endangered species so that we make informed, well thought out decisions. And to my knowledge, right now, the Biden administration, thankfully, has not suggested circumventing NEPA to fast track renewable energy projects. But that's sort of in the back of my mind, is are we going to fast track a lot of projects that are going to disrupt habitat? Are we going to put aside the protections we have for habitat and wildlife for the sake of our anthropogenic needs, which is, really climate change has now become a human problem, not a biocentric problem.
Before jumping in, guys, because that's a really fantastic line of questions from Greg on NEPA, but we should probably back up and make sure that everybody here is on the same page about what we're talking about fully. Just, I don't know if, Kyle, you could do a quick summary of what was being proposed by, I think, Senator Manchin, and as sort of a bargain, supposedly, in terms of, and what NEPA and EIS are, just so that everybody's on the same page before jumping into a thought and a response.
Yeah, sure. So the National Environmental Policy Act is one of our bedrock laws that basically is, it is a law that sort of does two things. It says, look, the federal government, before it takes any action, any major federal action, needs to look before it leaps, right? So what are the impacts of whatever the federal government is trying to propose? Whether that's a fossil fuel project or whether that's a solar panel. The other sort of critical component is public transparency, right? Public participation in this process. So it creates an opportunity for the public to be aware. So it's not just a process for the decision maker, but also the public to be both aware and an opportunity to engage in that decision-making process. So it's central to, I think the work that Matt and I do. What was being proposed by Senator Manchin in this sort of grand bargain is what people are calling permitting reform, which is how do you sort of fast-track the NEPA process in order to speed the process by which these projects get approved. I think the sort of Trojan horse of it is that you have many folks on the sort of climate hawk side of things who are saying, look, we need to rapidly build out renewable energy and windmills and solar panels, you've got them on the same side as the fossil fuel companies, which are saying, who have been saying for a long time that they want to, fast track or get rid of NEPA. So, I mean, that's basically the premise that we're dealing with. I mean, I've got my thoughts on that.
Please, yeah, that's a great summary. Thank you for that. And
Yeah.
it brings up such a great point. I mean, is it good then, in fact, that the law is slow and it requires you to slow down? Is that a feature, not a bug, to put it that phrase? Thoughts on before, or Matt, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think I've been a NEPA litigator for 25 years. It gets kind of a bad rap, but the drumbeat we're hearing now is a little disconcerting. I think the problem from my perspective is not so much the law, it's how it's implemented. Because if actually it's set up the way, if right now it just becomes like a pro forma thing that the agencies need to go through. It's a pain. They don't want to deal with it. They actually try to fast track it. But if it's set up with scoping, draft documents, alternatives, effects, an objection period, it's really an opportunity to get all stakeholders involved and make decisions. I just don't think it's actually implemented the way it was envisioned by Congress. But it probably does need some updating and tweaking. But I do feel like having stakeholder involvement and input, especially from traditional communities, the wildlife perspective, you really want to look before you leap, and I think it serves that purpose. I just think it could be implemented better.
Yeah. Kyle, thoughts?
Yeah, I think Matt's 100% right on that point. If you look at the sort of introductory language of NEPA, it talks in sort of a florid manner about all the important values that NEPA is intending to help support and facilitate and engage with. I think over the years, the way that has been interpreted by federal agencies is, okay, what is the line under which this decision or this process could get overturned in court? And so Matt's right. It turns into a sort of a box-checking exercise. And I think the answer is not to streamline that process, but go back to that sort of introductory language and say, what does it mean to meaningfully engage in a community? How do we take, not in my backyard or NIMBY, right? It becomes a real thing and a barrier to a lot of projects. But what would it mean to meaningfully engage in a community and to seek input from a community, and not just sort of use that as a box-checking exercise, but do so in a way that feedback is not only received, but then the public can see the way the agency's decision is then shaped by community feedback. And I think that would be a far more effective way of streamlining a process and avoiding litigation than simply saying, this is too much and we're just going to streamline it and cut out the public as much as possible. And some of the proposals, quite frankly, that you see from different groups that are proposing permitting reform, they're a bit of a red herring. Anytime you're on the same side as the oil and gas industry, you're probably not on the right side.
I was thinking the same thing, right? That we should point out and notice that the fact that they're pulling in the same direction, which should give one pause if you're serious about climate action. Looping back a little bit in terms of the law and its ability to address or not address the problems we have in front of us. One of the things I learned as a board member that I didn't realize before was you don't just sue people. I think of a group of lawyers who are really good at it, and I realized that actually the Western Environmental Law Center and other organizations like yours is actually involved in other work in terms of regulation and legislative advocacy. And so wanted to just sort of suggest that, is that different than the law, or are you working within the law? How does that fit within the work that you do as attorneys when, as a philosopher, I think, you just go into law, sue people under different statutes. What else do you do, and how much does that factor into your work?
I just sue people, so that.
Well, we do a lot of litigation, right? So that's, and some of our attorneys like Matt specialize in litigation, and so that's where they spend a lot of their time. It's where I've spent a lot of my time as well as in court. But there are different tools that we employ. Litigation is one of them. Policy engagement is another one. Coalition work and building is another one. I do a lot of work, for example, in the greater Chaco landscape in the Four Corners region, working with frontline communities and indigenous peoples on fossil fuel exploitation there. And then the fourth tool that we really employ is communication. So how do we talk about our work? How do we talk about the issues? And that's not only something that we're working towards, it just like, we won a case, press release. We're working on with our communications team to use that within our program work as well to sort of try to help shape the debate.
I think it's a healthy sign that we see that sort of the use of the law is in that more robust sort of way in creating coalitions and advocating for community participation and change is not something a lot of people would necessarily assume that you do.
And the litigation is tied to broader campaigns, just, to kind of reiterate what Kyle said earlier. We don't really typically do a one-off case unless there's a good reason for it. But for the most part, we're working on broader campaigns and trying to achieve a certain mission objective, usually over the course of a decade. So,
yeah. So, I'm not sure if you have a position on this, but regularly we've hosted discussions about the rights of nature. So we hosted a debate with Thomas Lindsay, who's, of course, a global advocate for advocating for the rights of nature, not our rights to a healthy environment. So the Montana v. Held case that we'll be talking about next semester is a good example, I think, of where you've got in the Montana Supreme Court, or Montana Constitution, the right to a healthy environment. That's the citizen's right to a healthy environment, which is important, and that gives you a legal tool that you wouldn't otherwise have. But the rights of nature, as I understand it, is going even farther and saying that we should recognize the rights of nature itself, rather not only our rights to nature, but its rights as well. And Thomas Lindsay argues, if I understand him correctly, that he just doesn't think that the systems we have in sort of the prudential systems and the precedents that we have aren't sufficient. We can't really get the job done. I'm putting words in his mouth, so I'll just say this in my voice. Can we get the job done without going even farther than our current systems allow us to do and actually recognize the rights of nature legally as legal persons, for example, with more legal standing, so that the river keeper in Spokane could sue on behalf of the river and wouldn't have to show damages and standing? You would be able to say, no, it's enough that the river itself is polluted. I'm suing on behalf of the river because its rights have been violated. Our current system doesn't allow that. The river has no standing. Do you think the system that we've designed should be modified to make that possible?
That's a great question. It used to be there was some litigation where you would name the species as a plaintiff. I can't remember how those played out. Not well. The issue now, you're right, it's more like how does it affect your interest in grizzly bears versus the bear itself? But I can speak personally and say, my first case I worked on, we won this Mexican wolf case, and I got interviewed by the reporter from the New York Times, and my response was, well, I think Mexican wolves have an inherent right to exist irrespective of any value they have to me or society. And the client called me up. It's a national environmental group and was irate. And they told me, you'll never talk to the press again. And I was basically told to be quiet. But that's my personal motivation. It's not shared by everybody. Whether or not you need to go that far to get where you want to go, that's above my pay grade, Brian. I'm not sure. Maybe Greg's got some
Before I turn it to Greg, though, just because you mentioned it earlier, Matt, that you have a biocentric worldview, and some of my students are here who take my environmental ethics class, and one of the discussions we have is whether or not someone's underlying worldview, their underlying values and assumptions and beliefs really matter to affecting policy changes, the changes to the law. And so one side would say, we don't need to change hearts and minds. We just need to pass better policies. We just need to get laws passed. We don't need to and don't have time to change people's minds. And then you can imagine the other side, right, which is this idea that no, the real project is what people believe and their attitudes. And so you're sort of channeling the latter, right?
Well, when I started, I remember having this conversation with my boss in New Mexico, where I remember telling him, I don't really care what the public thinks because the law says X. They violated the law. I should win this case. And I think that's really naive now. I've been at it for 25 years. I've come along. We're really storytellers. You know, litigators, lawyers, it's all about the story. And you got to get buy-in. And the more buy-in from the ground up, frankly, like the first-line communities like the Greater Chaco area, the better, right? And I feel like it's all tied to the story and the narrative to get people to care, to read about a case, to want to do something, and to get engaged. I feel very fortunate and really privileged to be even thinking about wolverines, frankly. If I had grown up in inner city Detroit with burning rivers, I probably wouldn't be working on wolverines. You know, I was very fortunate to grow up where I did in Montana. That's what I'm passionate about, that's what I do. So I do feel like, you know, in these cases and in these issues, you have to have buy-in from the community. It matters. People need to care about it. It's not enough.
Buy-in, you mean what they believe, what they value, what they care about?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Because I also feel like, you know, there's sort of the basic level of the clerks and the judge are people in parts of society. If they don't have buy-in, you're probably not going to win your case. But bigger than that, I just feel like to support the work and the groundswell to actually effectuate long-term change, you got to have buy-in. And I think it's bottom-up buy-in, not top-down.
Kyle, do you agree?
You know, I was thinking about this, and I'm going to sort of get this quote not exactly right, but sort of Einstein once said, you can't solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it, right? So thinking about this and thinking about sort of rights of nature, you know, again, I do a lot of work in coalition and on behalf of indigenous-led advocacy groups and in those communities. What they would say is that, you know, their rights are not fully realized and respected within our current legal system. And I think that's 100% right. You know, we oftentimes think of colonialism as sort of a pastime, right? And, you know, they're
Not a pastime, but
in
time.
Correct.
Maybe both, but
And maybe
For
that's,
some
you know,
people, maybe
and I think
colonialism is a pastime.
you could look at sort of nation states still operating within that system. I think, you know, indigenous-led groups that I work with in the Greater Chaco landscape, for example, they would say that colonization is now happening on behalf of corporations, right? The oil and gas companies that go in and operate in that landscape are the colonizers, right? And so they're still within this framework of oppression. And so, you know, are we to a place where that is going to be fully rectified, whether it be for, you know, indigenous peoples in our country or whether it's rights of natures? Is that going to be fully rectified within our current legal system? I'm not sure about that. But I do think that, you know, our approach needs to be more inclusive and our thinking needs to be more inclusive than just sort of narrowly focusing on here is what the law tells me, and we need to be more visionary in our approach and our strategies that, again, we do a lot of litigation at WELC, but we do other work as well, and I think there is an opportunity to advocate on behalf of species, on behalf of rights of nature, on behalf of traditional ecological knowledge in other venues than just in court. And again, all of these things can lend itself to the sort of tipping points that we're working towards.
Yeah, and I think the rights of nature is a great intersection between the culture and law. I mean, there's a historical framework for rights of nature. William O. Douglas, you know, in his famous dissent, you know, William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice from Washington, grew up, and I think that's the idea, that your values frame how you see the world, and he grew up exploring the Cascades. He grew up as a mountain climber, became Justice of the Supreme Court, and in that Sierra Club v. Morton case in the 1970s, early 70s, you know, argued that valley in California, in Yosemite, had an intrinsic right to exist, and the rights of nature needed to be embedded in the legal framework. And that it gains a little bit of traction, right? I mean, here and there, and the more and more people talk about it, it becomes embedded into our cultural system. And sooner or later, the law and the culture, and I think you raised the point about gay marriage, right? And there's a great example of how culture kind of drove the law, but at the same time, we needed the Bill of Rights as a way of sort of integrating those two factors. And I think that's what we see with the rights of nature, is this opportunity to integrate, our cultural values, push forth, the values from indigenous people within the Western sort of legal framework, right? And I think for Native peoples, rights of nature is kind of not really the right language, because it's still embedded in that Western, if you want to use the word from colonial mindset of that legal, European Roman law framework of rights, whereas, for a lot of indigenous communities, it's about more of the reciprocity type of relationship.
Kinship.
Who are you in relationship to others? For philosophy, Martin Buber, the I-thou relationships between humans and other beings. But within our current system it's a Western way of thinking, rights of nature seems to be the most logical thing that we have within our present mindset and our present way of thinking that integrates, our biocentric values within the legal framework. I don't know what you guys, as attorneys, think about that.
Christopher Stone, Do Trees Have Standing? Good essay on this topic. So if you're interested in learning more about the legal case that this was, so Christopher Stone's famous essay on this topic, Do Trees Have Standing? And so he just argues that we should use traditional guardianship law, and if we use guardianship law and extend legal personhood to non-human legal persons, then we wouldn't really have to modify the law. We're just applying it to additional persons. And so it's not a radical, throwing something out and starting over. It's at least in Stone's version of it. And it was surprising that Douglas agreed in his dissent. It was just unfortunate that it was a dissent. This has been really good so far, and we haven't given you an opportunity. So if you have a question, you might start formulating it. And if you're at home and you're fast, you can email me at climateinstitute@gonzaga.edu. If you have a question and you're somewhere else in the world and want to try and pose it, feel free to email climateinstitute@gonzaga.edu. Are there folks in the room who are provoked by the conversation and would like to contribute, starting maybe with some of the students? If you had a question, raise your hand to ask any of our panelists. Just mention your name and major, if you would.
I'm Kieran Boyle. I'm an environmental studies major at Gonzaga. And my question's kind of bouncing off the rights of nature conversation. I looked into, just while I'm sitting here, Joe Manchin kind of specifically, because we were talking about NEPA and how he's kind of affecting NEPA and that process. And, one of the things that I think about is a lot of his motivation for what he's doing with NEPA right now maybe is because of who's funding his campaigns and who's getting him elected. And I guess, isn't that same reasoning for rights of nature, of giving legal personhood to non-human entities, kind of the same reasoning that we use to allow oil and gas companies to fund campaigns?
It's a great question and an astute observation, I would say. I think it's an interesting thing to follow the money, right? And our politicians, in terms of their campaign contributions, we can really see that. Greg mentioned before too, this is COP28 that's starting tomorrow. The oil and gas industry has understood the mechanisms of climate change since the 1950s, right? The White House has understood. There was a report during the Johnson administration about climate change. And what that report said is, this is real, this is happening, and the same sort of mechanisms that are discussed in that report that a lot of the research done by the fossil fuel industry back in the 1950s, that is now just being borne out, right? And you can look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, something that Joe Manchin had a lot of influence in, right? And what does the Inflation Reduction Act do? The IRA creates a lot of incentives for sort of demand side sort of growth of renewables or replacement fuels. But this is all within the realm of the same sort of profit generation that so much of our country and our economy operates on. What it doesn't do is to address the sort of supply side issues that continue to plague the United States and around the world. And I think that is very intentional, both in the Inflation Reduction Act and basically in any other sort of piece of legislation or policy that you see sort of coming through. And I think that is a primary area that we need to focus on. You know, you can look at the projections of what does the IRA do, and it says, you know, production based on the IRA will actually increase, not only in the United States, but it's like for domestic consumption, but primarily for export, right? At the same time, you know, demand side sort of use will go down. And that framework does not, you know, if that supply side increases through 2030, we are blowing past 2 degrees Celsius, right? So getting at that financial side of things is an intractable problem and something fundamentally that we need to address if we're going to build power for change. The philosophical question that you asked is a really good one too, and I think, yeah, you know, it's like we've seen the ways that our law and our politicians will bend over for in furtherance of capitalism, and
To make a really direct connection, because I think maybe this was on your mind, is the law that allows corporations to be considered as legal persons under Citizens United is exactly the same logic that you would just say, well, if we allow corporations to be legal persons, then why would we have such a concern about allowing not, you know, which is not a, it's a run by humans, but it's not a natural person either. And that's established law going well back into the 19th century. And so saying that are non-human legal persons isn't so controversial, but it does worry me a little bit that we're then pulling in the same direction as Citizens United. We're like, I'm not sure we want to go that direction. Are you wanting to say that's a good thing?
I guess I kind of think that where my question is coming from is the Einstein quote that you used of, can we solve the problem with the same consciousness that created the problem? And some of these problems that are being created are because oil and gas companies are funding politicians to be politicians and to hold elected office. And so if we're using their logic of this is how it works with money, so like, okay, so if that's how it works with money, then this is how it should work with nature, then is that really going to be a solution to the problem, or do we need to think more outside the box?
I think some of the most effective climate litigation now, Kyle's doing great work. The public trust cases like Held, it's really interesting as well. But there are a group of plaintiffs' attorneys who are representing municipalities and suing corporations under the same theory they used to sue the cigarette companies, where you knew about it and you lied to the public about it. And I think hitting these corporations in the pocketbook big time is going to effectuate a lot of change. And it's really exciting to see what's going on. I don't know how many cases there are, but one of our old board members is doing a lot of this work out of California, and I think they're having a lot of success. I mean, they're fighting like hell in all the different jurisdictions. I think they're trying to keep them in state court, but there's been battles. But that's kind of interesting to see how that plays out, because if you follow the money, you hit them in the pocketbook, I think you can really effectuate some change there. Significant pocketbook damage.
Since it was your quote, before we go to the next question, did you want to riff on that, or are you good?
That's all right.
No, I mean, I think I think that's right, you know, and I think Matt's point is also a really good one. You know, I think about, you know, the accountability prong of our work too, and that really is, so here's the thing, right? Like our entire US economy is based on this idea of endless growth, endless exploitation, and without that endless exploitation, you know, we fall into a recession or a depression, right? So our entire measure for how our economy doing is based on this idea of exponential growth. And, you know, oil and gas companies in particular, you know, they do not, every oil and gas well that they drill, they're borrowing money to drill that well. They're not paying out of their pocket for that new well. Every oil and gas well that they plug, that is coming out of their pocket. And so they are incentivized not to clean up after themselves, even though that is a legal requirement that they have for every drilling permit that they get. But we're at this sort of tension point right now where, and I think this is also part of the sort of, you know, the system or the mindset creating the problem, right? Like all of our economy is based on not just, you know, oil and gas companies being too big to fail, but who are funding these projects, and it's our biggest banks and financial institutions in both the United States and the world. So you can't sort of address that funding problem without sort of threatening the perpetuation of or precipitating a impact to our economy as a whole with the way that the financial instruments sort of move. So yeah, how we create that different mindset, what is that different mindset? Again, I don't know that I have the answer to that, but I do know that part of the answer is this power building element, right? Demanding a different way or demanding a different approach.
Hi, my name is Bee. I am a professor in political science here at Gonzaga. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's fascinating. I have two questions maybe for Matt regarding the Endangered Species Act. The first is, can you tell us a little bit more about the pushback you guys got during the 15, 20 years of advocacy for the wolverine? And the second question is related, but considering more general Endangered Species Act, especially I'm thinking about the species that could have been listed under ESA but are not. And we know there are different reasons. It could be the libertarian pushback, like just don't list another toad, tell me what to do. And you know, you probably know the controversy around northern spotted owls when it was being listed. Like listing another thing, is it going to kill the bill, you know, entirely? And or there are other reasons they're not just as majestic or as cute. So they're not being listed. Have these thoughts informed your work, or what are your thoughts on those could have been listed but are not?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. We've had a lot of discussions internally at WELC. You know, sometimes you work on these like charismatic megafauna, and maybe those are more. But you know, that really doesn't inform the decisions we make. We try to make the decision based on the science. Remember, we had a discussion 20 years ago about the lamprey, and there's some discussions about listing the lamprey. I don't know if people know what those are. They're like a sucker that lives, almost look like an eel in the Columbia River Basin. They're not the most attractive animal, but all signs indicated that they probably qualified for listing. I can't remember why we didn't take it, but that wasn't one of the reasons. But you know, these decisions, it's hard to know what motivates the agencies. I think right now with climate change happening, I think the federal government is a little concerned about the sky falling and getting inundated with so many listing decisions, being overwhelmed, that they don't want to open the floodgates, so they're being extra careful in terms of how they approach climate science, how far out are they going to define the foreseeable future for listing. Those types of things are happening. I think the wolverine decision is a really great example of them taking a leap of faith and making decisions saying, hey, the decision has to be based on the best available science, and that's not the best possible science or the most perfect science. You're never going to have the smoking gun, for instance, for wolverine, okay? We don't know a lot about wolverines. We know they're snow dependent. We don't fully understand how the loss of snow in the West is going to affect them. Our position to the court was, you don't need to know. It's enough to know that they have an obligate relationship with snow. Everywhere that they den in snow, if you're not going to have snow, they're probably going to be in trouble. The other side, the states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, and API, and Safari Club International, lots of groups came on and said, no, you need to fully understand how Wolverine and the loss of snow in dens, how they're going to respond. And if you can't list. So you can see how high the bar would be. Fortunately, we're very fortunate in Montana to have some very thoughtful, fair, intelligent federal judges who seem interested in these issues because, frankly, there's a lot of deference to these agencies. Judges aren't scientists. They're going to want to defer, typically, to these cases. That's the standard of review we use. But they have to get the science right, and they can't lie about studies or they can't ignore the best available science. So, for instance, with Wolverine, we had 5 or 6 peer-reviewed papers saying, hey, you need a list. Here's the situation. And on the other side, they didn't have a single paper. They had an internal memo from a regional officer who said, wait, I think we need more certainty before we can list. That's how we were able to win the case, because the federal judge said, wait a minute, I'm going to apply the best available science. It's not like I got peer-reviewed papers here, peer-reviewed papers here. I'd probably lose that case. But that's why coming back to understanding the science, I think in some ways, as a history major, I used to think of as a real limitation because I'm not a scientist, but in some ways you're the filter between the scientist and the court. So if I can't understand it and write about it, the judge won't either. He or she will have a hard time. So I think in some ways it's helpful. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, the first one. So there's a lot of species. We've been looking at a lot of different insect species. It's hard to do it all. There are a lot of groups and a lot of attorneys doing a lot of it work, but I rely heavily on scientists with conservation organizations who kind of put together the petitions, and then we kind of evaluate the decisions after they're made. But I don't know if I answered the question. Okay.
Hi, my name is Linda Carroll. I have 2 related questions that, that maybe related, maybe not, but that have to do with the federal government and some of these issues. And one of them touches on exactly what you've just said, the agency issue. We know that there are several cases coming up before the Supreme Court where more sort of libertarian-oriented groups or individuals are trying to reduce the role of agencies, and reduce may be a mild version of what they want. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how various outcomes could affect the kind of work that you do. And the other question I have is that, the current administration is saying, well, in the long term we want to reduce, but in the short term they seem to be increasing the number of permits given for fossil fuel extraction on federal lands. And is there some way to deal with that? To push back against that? So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
You want to take the fossil fuel?
Yeah, the Supreme Court right now is problematic on a lot of fronts, right? But it is, I think, important to understand where the authority of agencies to act comes from, right? So if you look at EPA under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, that authority comes from the Commerce Clause. And so a lot of the clawing back that you see at the Supreme Court right now comes from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Interestingly, all of our public lands decision-making, the Department of Interior, that decision-making is vested within the Property Clause. That is the absolute sort of apex of federal authority, and is the disposition of federal property. And so we actually feel that becomes, in light of where the Supreme Court is going, that action within the sort of property clause and on public lands is actually a safer place for us to operate. The problem with, the grand bargain of the Inflation Reduction Act, right, is that it perpetuates oil and gas leasing on federal lands for at least another 10 years. That is a problem. But it's one that we've been working on for a long time at WELC and certainly in partner organizations. We have a lawsuit right now in the District Court of DC that challenges over 4,000 drilling permits that have been approved in two primary oil and gas producing basins, the Permian Basin in southeast New Mexico, and the Permian goes into West Texas as well. As well as the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. That represented about 75% of federal permit approvals over the first 16 months of the Biden administration. So, so the answer is yes, that it is highly problematic. And, again, I sort of in response to a question earlier, I spoke about, the Inflation Reduction Act and what that means in terms of supply side. And if we play that supply side out in terms of not only sort of the US, but sort of we can see this also mirrored around the world. Norway, for example, is now almost primarily all sort of domestic energy is coming from almost all renewables. At the same time, they're authorizing a vast expansion of drilling permits in the North Sea. And they're unwilling to address that because it, again, affects the profitability of whether they're state-owned assets or whether they're private companies. So it's a place where we're certainly doing a lot of work on. I mean, that's really on the climate energy team. That's really the heart of the work that we do is those sort of supply side issues on our public lands. So,
Greg, did you want to get in as well?
Well, this is actually a question for Kyle based on that, and I'm wondering, with all your work with energy development, are we really entering a transition? Are we really replacing fossil fuels with renewables, or are renewables a way that we can meet our ever-increasing energy demand? You see where I'm going with this? Yeah. It's like we need more and more electricity, so are we meeting that demand through solar, wind, et cetera? I mean, we're getting rid of coal gradually, but are we really replacing fossil fuels, or are we just adding to the mix?
Well, right now we're adding, and we're projected to add until right now, at least mid-century. That's a problem, right? And so there's a lot that can be done. Obviously, we need a very rapid transition into renewables, improving transmission. There's also a lot to do on the energy efficiency side of things. A lot is also talked about of not only energy consumption in the United States and how we make that transition, but globally, how do developing economies sort of leapfrog a lot of the fossil fuel dependence that the largely industrialized world has grown off of for the last century. And so, but right now, you're 100% right. There is no, ratcheting down of fossil fuel demand. It's only increasing. And if it increases for the next 10 years, which all the projections suggest that they will, that we're blowing past 2 degrees centigrade warming.
And in a way that brings us back in a helpful and depressing way to the problem that the talk is about, the panel is about, which is the longer we wait, the longer we delay, the larger the problem gets, and the more dramatic the changes are going to need to be in order to be able to meaningfully address the problem. And that pushes then the pressure of just bargains that are not bargains, right? And the idea that we just don't have any choice but to make these sacrifices because we've waited too long, and now things are so catastrophic we're willing to do anything. And so so the longer we wait, the more pronounced this problem that we're talking about tonight, I think, becomes. I think it'd be a good time to maybe wrap and go. I didn't warn them of this, but in maybe in opposite order of any concluding thoughts on this conversation we've had tonight about the challenge of we've got a biodiversity crisis, which is its own sort of problem. It intersects with climate change, and if we were to address them, we have them. We're trying to hold them together and think about these twin crises we've got: biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and the law as a tool to address those. And so, just as far as concluding comments, if they have any, I did not warn them that they were going to be invited. Starting with Dr. Gordon and going across it.
Yeah. I do want to address your question about the Supreme Court, because I don't know that came up. And I think the Sackett case, that was before the Supreme Court very recently, and kind of undermined the EPA's ability to regulate wetlands. And I'm really worried that that is going to undermine the whole Administrative Procedures Act, which gives authority to government agencies to regulate. And we haven't, I don't know, I don't think we've seen much fallout yet, but I'm really worried that we're going to see a diminishing of the administrative authority to take on regulations, everything from food and drugs to wetlands to, you know, everything we have. In terms of wrapping up, I think, you know, Matt made a good point about the wolverine, right? It's a great example that these twin problems are not inseparable, right? They're linked, they're related. We don't know that we can really address one without the other, but you know, again, I think about where we are politically, globally, you know, with how we're addressing climate change. It's not fast enough, it's not happening very rapidly, but I think we look at what happened last year in Montreal with the biodiversity accord, where, you know, most of the countries, 190 some odd countries, signed a biodiversity accord to pledge that 30% of their land and sea and waterways would be protected by 2030. You know, it seems that protecting habitat is not a hard lift for people, and I think the ability to capture the imagination, right? Polar bears, wolverines, grizzly bears, charismatic megafauna, even, I mean, cutthroat trout, right? People love fish. People love animals. We have this biophilia, innate connection to the wild world, and I think the challenge for climate change is it's so much more abstract. It's so much more embedded in legal frameworks and politics and technocratic solutions. And I think in some ways it's an easier lift for the majority of people to sort of wrap their heads around the need to protect animals, habitat, and biodiversity. Protecting species, rights of nature is almost easier to deal with than, you know, reducing CO2 emissions. It's sad to say, but I think that's something that we can, if we want to think about what to be hopeful for, I think that protecting biodiversity gives us a really tangible thing to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, I just say I agree. I mean, I think one of the things that makes the West so special is that we still have, in a lot of it, fully intact ecosystems. It's really unique, and it's worth fighting for. I mean, for me, I think a lot of this stuff is really heavy, and it's so easy to get down. I think what motivates me in my little piece is I'm trying to make, you know, be the change, you know, that I want to see, and it's a small piece, but, if, you know, we only have so much time. I don't want to spend my time making corporations more money. I want to make the West and the world a better place, and it might just be a teeny thing here and there, a small win here or there, but it's what motivates me to do the work, and I feel very fortunate and privileged to do it. I mean, it's really, if someone had told me in law school I'd be litigating to protect wolverine and grizzly bears in the West, you know, I've said this a million times, I would have given my left arm for it. It's my dream job. So I just encourage anybody to do that, to follow your passion, because if you're really passionate about it, you put the time in, and hopefully it'll be meaningful and you make some change at the end of the day. But try not to get too down as you can easy enough with reading the news every day. And my mom watches CNN, and it's hard. But, you know, just take my little piece of the world and do what I can do and make it a better place. Sorry. Want to give me a hug?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. You know, the idea sort of framed up in this conversation, right, that there's a trade-off to be made, right, between the rapid sort of energy transition that is demanded and these things that our humanity and our experience on this earth are sort of centered on, which is relationships to one another, relationships to the natural world, and that we have to sacrifice that somehow in order to make the energy transition. I think that that's like a false narrative and a false dichotomy in a way that if we land there in that trade-off, then we're sort of doing industry's bidding for them, right, in some respect, right? I think, my sense in doing this work is, there are colleagues that I work with who also are fighting fossil fuels, and yet have not done the individual human work of internalizing what all of this science and data is telling us, right? It takes work to actually sit with oneself and be like, what does all of this mean in terms of my life and the choices that I'm making? At the same time, this is not about individual choices, right? This is about systemic change at scale and at pace. But we need to do the work of internalizing these crises within ourselves in order to really face clear-eyed the transition and what that means. My work also is about creating points of leverage, right? How do we use the law incrementally over time and use policy and coalition building and communications over time to create and precipitate sort of a point of leverage and a tipping point to have change on the scale and the pace at what we need. And then the third piece of that is, and I said this before, but it's power building. It's how do we do this together to demand change and systemic change on the scale that's demanded. And I think those are the sort of three things that I would leave with folks, which is, if we stand a chance, because the information is really bleak, it's about being very clear-eyed and internalizing what is actually being asked of us in this moment, and then using sort of everything that we have to meet the moment, and to, I'm a father of 3 kids, so I spend a lot of time thinking about their future. What's the world that they're going to inherit? And, as Matt said, it's a privilege to do this work, but it's also a privilege that, whatever future my kids inherit, it's probably going to have less options and less choice than I grew up with. But I want them to know that, I fought like hell to make sure that they still had some options for their lives in the future. And the moment that we can internalize that, the sooner that we can internalize that, I think the better off we'll be.
Just to conclude, sorry, I shouldn't have stepped on that applause line. Well done, Kyle. If I can take the moderator's sort of luxury of offering a concluding thought as well. Part of what worries me in talking a lot about climate change is focusing much of my professional life on it. That is also inspiring this panel tonight, is that those who really are worried about the climate crisis, I think frequently don't realize that they have maybe a slightly impoverished imagination for what they're actually pursuing. That, for example, we would at this point be lucky to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, especially the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is such an important goal. But we also have the 2 degrees Celsius as well. So we're aiming at these things, and it would require, and is going to require, an enormous transformation. But when we're committing to these things and we're debating about these in the context of COP28 just starting, what we're actually agreeing to is allowing a world to be created in which many island nations are submerged, many coral reefs are gone, a number of species are extinct, a number of glaciers are reasonably going to be gone on human timescales. And they're gone, when they're gone on human timescales. And we get so motivated by trying to achieve meaningful action, and we need to, and I spend a lot of time doing that, but we need to be more clear-eyed in realizing that what's at stake is more than just human life, that there are a lot of other beings with which we inhabit the planet. And so when we agree to something like a 2 degrees Celsius warming, we're agreeing to a significant amount of loss. We're counting that as success to a significant degree, and that's sad. And so part of what I want to say is thinking about wild things and wild spaces and the role they play in our imagination and our lives, and Matt, is everything you've said tonight is such a great example of that, is we don't want to accidentally, unintentionally create a world where there aren't other beautiful wild things in the world. There are futures wherein we define success as being not dead, where there aren't other wild things, and we think of that as success. And that's not good enough. And we should then use the motivation today to realize that if we want significant wild spaces, we want significant other wild things with which we inhabit the world, then that requires much more action than we've been pursuing right now. And that isn't something we have to choose between things. We should use the one in part, is what I'm suggesting, to motivate the other, if we can, to use the wild things that don't have voices, advocate on their behalf, in order to drive the levels of transformation and the kinds of transformation that are needed to address the climate crisis. So this has been such a fun conversation, our last of the semester. We look forward to having you again next semester. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.